Good morning students. Welcome to physical education class of class plus 2. Today we are going to discuss about the last portion of the chapter Biomechanics and Sports. In this video module we are going to cover body movements and axis and planes. First of all, let's start with body movements. The 5 golden rules of skeletal muscle activity. With a few exceptions, all skeletal muscles cross at least one joint. Typically, the bulk of a skeletal muscle lies proximal to the joint crossed. All skeletal muscles have at least 2 attachments, the origin and insertion. Skeletal muscles can only pull, they never push. During contraction, a skeletal muscle insertion moves toward the origin. First one, muscles and body movements. Movement results when a muscle moves and attached bone. Muscles are attached to at least 2 points, origin and insertion. Attachment to an immovable bone is called origin, and attachment to a movable bone is called insertion. Now, in this picture, you can see the origin part comes over there, the beginning of the bone, and the end part, the insertion part comes to the last side, and here you can see when the muscles would be contracting, we are able to move our hands, then when it relaxes, it comes back to the rest position. Then types of ordinary body movements: flexion and extension. Flexion means the decreases of the angle of the joint. It brings 2 bones closer together. It is typical of hinge joints like knee and elbow, where they are usually found. This type of body movements are possible only with the knee and elbow. The next one is extension. It is just opposite to flexion, and it increases the angle between 2 bones. That means opening. You can see in this picture, the first picture, when the hands move forward, it is flexion. The angle gets widened until it comes to a rest position. Then in the same picture you can see the leg movement shows the flexion. The angle, open angle, would be just getting into a closer mode, and when it opens, it moves to an extension mode. So the closer one is flexion and the open one is extension. So you can see the third picture there, when the hands would be moving backward, by the time it is in extension form. The angle between the body and the hand would be just getting increased. So when it moves forward, it gets decreased. So the hand's movement, when it moves forward, it is flexion, and when it moves backward, it is extension. For the leg, when the legs comes to the rest position and to the movement, when it takes to the front portion or the front movement, by the time it is in extension mode, and when it moves back, it is in flexion mode. The types of ordinary body movements. Hyperextension. Hyperextension means extension itself is widening, and hyperextension means widening more. So hyperextension results when the angle is 180 degree. So you can see that usual mode, from the usual mode to the front position, when we move the head, by the time it is in flexion mode, and when it goes to back and going back up to or more than 90 degree, it is called extension mode. And when it crosses this 90 degree up to 180 degree, it is called hyperextension mode of movements. The next one, that is rotation. The movement of a bone around its longitudinal axis is called rotation. It is common in ball and socket joints. Example is when you move atlas around the axis vertebra, that is when you shake head to say no, it is in rotation mode. The leg also, you can see there are two types of rotation. When you move the leg to the left leg to the left side, it is in lateral rotation, and when it is moved to the right, when the left leg is moved to the right, it is called medial rotation. Then types of body movements: abduction and adduction. Abduction means the movement of a limb away from the midline is called abduction, and adduction means opposite to abduction, the movement of a limb towards the midline. So when you raise your hand, it is in abduction mode, and when you just bring it back, it is in adduction mode. And when you just make your hand in rotation mode, it is in circumduction. Okay. The third one is circumduction. That combination of flexion, extension, abduction and adduction. These four movements are joined together to form circumduction. It is common in all ball and socket joints. So you can see when you just move upside, it is in adduction. When you bring back your hand, it is adduction. And when you just move your hands forward, it is flexion. And when you move your hand or the arm back, it is in extension mode. So all these four modes are joined together to form the fifth category, circumduction. Then the special movements: dorsiflexion, lifting the foot so that the superior surface approaches the shin is called as dorsiflexion. And again, plantar flexion is also there, that depressing the foot, that is moving the leg down to form the straight line, that we call as plantar flexion. Okay, so if you just bend your foot upward and towards the shin, it is dorsiflexion, and when it moves and straighten your foot, it is called plantar flexion. And the next one is insertion and eversion. So you can see as in picture, when the left leg or the right leg is turned, the sole of the foot is turned medially, we call it as insertion. And when it turns sole of the foot to the lateral position, it is called eversion. And the next one is supination and pronation. Supination means when the forearm rotates laterally, so palm faces up to the anterior position, it is called supination. And when the forearm rotates medially, so the palm faces down is called, or to the posterior portion, it is called pronation. So in the picture you can see that supination, the radius and ulna are parallel, and the next one in pronation, radius and the radius rotates over ulna. So this is the usual position that we can say that supination and pronation. And the next one is opposition. Opposition means move the thumb to touch the tip of the other fingers on the same hand is called as opposition movement. Let's discuss about planes and axes. The anatomical position. The position of the reference for all types of movements are also called as standing supine position. Anatomical position is neutral position, and when it is standing upright, legs together, knees straight, toes pointing towards and forward, arms by the side, then palms facing forward. This position is called as anatomical position. The next one, the body performs movements through a plane and around an axis. Plane. A plane is an imaginary flat surface along which a movement takes place. So you can see there are three: sagittal plane, coronal plane and horizontal plane. The next one is axis. An axis is an imaginary line around which the body or the limbs rotates. There are also three types: sagittal axis, coronal axis, transverse axis. The first one about the planes. You can see there are three types of planes: cardinal plane, parallel plane and diagonal plane. Three imaginary perpendicular reference planes that divide the body in half by mass and represent where the axial skeleton movement takes place is called cardinal plane. The second one, parallel plane. It is an imaginary surface where the movement of appendicular skeleton take place. The third one, diagonal plane. It is a plane other than cardinal or parallel plane where movement occurs in a diagonal pattern. The next one, cardinal planes of the body. You can see there are three: sagittal, frontal and transverse. Sagittal planes divides the body into left and right halves. Frontal divides the body into front and back halves. Transverse divides the body into top and bottom halves. So you can see that there are three types of planes: sagittal, which divides the left and right halves, dividing the body into exact half. The second one is frontal, that divides the body into front and back. And transverse divides the body into top and bottom halves. First one, sagittal plane. A vertical plane of the body which passes from the front to rear, dividing the body into two symmetrical halves. A sagittal plane is an anatomical plane which divides the body into right and left parts. The next one, sagittal plane movements. Forward and backward movements. The whole body, forward and backward movement such as front and back flips. Then as the segmental, we can see that flexion that we discussed earlier. Flexion, the movements of a leg and hands. Flexion, extension, hyperextension, then dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. The last two are of angles. Then back flips and the front flips are whole body sagittal plane movements that you can see when you take the back flip or the front flips. The whole body will be moving in the sagittal plane movements. For a cyclist, the leg movements occur in the sagittal plane. Then forward and backward movements are at specific joints such as shoulder and ankle at sagittal plane movements. Then frontal plane movements, sideward and vertical movement. When the whole body sideward movement are seen in sideward cartwheels. When the cartwheel is done, by the time the body movement is towards the sideward and vertical movements, and that refers to frontal plane movements. Frontal plane movements, sideward and vertical movements. As the segments we can see abduction, adduction, lateral flexion, then elevation and depression of the shoulder girdle, that is scapula, upward and downward rotation of the shoulder girdle, that is also scapula, then radial deviation and ulnar deviation, both of them are the part of the wrist movement. When the hip abduction and adduction, we can see that it is the part of the frontal plane movements. When ulnar and radial deviation, that is also considered as the frontal plane movements. The next one is with the scapula, elevation and depression of the shoulder girdle or scapula is also considered as the part of the frontal plane movements, or that is sideward movement. Then frontal plane movements, the lateral flexion, that is as the picture illustrates, when the trunk moves either left or right, it is in lateral flexion. So that is the part of frontal plane movements. Then the third category is transverse plane movements or horizontal movement. When the whole body horizontal movement or rotation, as in skaters or dancers pirouette. So when the pirouette and the whole body rounding movement is done, it is in horizontal movement. We can see the anatomical reference to axis. Axis is a plural of axis. An imaginary axis of rotation that passes through a joint to which it is attached is called as axis. Then there are three: frontal or x-axis or mediolateral axis, sagittal or anterior-posterior axis or z-axis, then longitudinal axis or y-axis. Movement, both whole body and segmental, takes place in cardinal planes and around the cardinal axis. Then axis. The ellipse represents the transverse plane and the black line represents the y-axis. The y-axis is perpendicular to the transverse plane. Therefore, a point which rotates around the y-axis will move the transverse plane. Essentially, the movement in a given plane takes place around the axis that is perpendicular to the plane. X-axis movements. So it passes from side to side. Rotation in the sagittal plane takes place around x-axis. You can see that the extension, hyperextension and flexion comes as the part of this movement. Then y-axis. It passes from top to bottom. Rotation in transverse plane takes place around the y-axis. When we bend forward and moving our hands to the left or right or stretching, by the time the movement comes in y-axis platform. The last category is z-axis. It passes from front to back. Its rotation is in frontal plane, which takes place around the z-axis. The last portion that illustrates this planes and axis. The cardinal axis lie at the intersection of the cardinal plane, and that you can see, and the cardinal planes and the axis all intersect at the center of gravity. This is the end of the lesson. Thank you for watching this video. Stay at home, stay safe. May good God bless you.